security institutions are either unable or unwilling to handle the perceived crime problem. But the more popular understanding of vigilantism is, of course, to take the law into their own hands. One of the characteristics of vigilantism is that it's usually biased. Vigilantes tend to direct their attention towards certain marginalized groups in society, such as ethnic minorities or migrants accused of being potential criminals and threats to our security or social and moral order. In many European countries, Roma people, or so-called gypsies, have for a long time been targeted by particularly aggressive vigilante activities. And during the last few years, refugees and migrants have taken over as the main target group. We brought together a group of experts with case studies of vigilantism from 17 countries around the world. And this data set provides a basis for comparative analysis of this phenomenon by asking them to explore such issues as how do these vigilante groups operate and how are they organized? What are the external justifications, group strategies, and individual motivations behind this form of vigilante activism? And under what kinds of circumstances do these vigilante activities emerge, flourish, or fail? What are the facilitating and impeding or permissive and repressive factors? Just to give you a brief overview of the case studies, I won't go into them, but we cover Ku Klux Klan vigilantism, Jewish vigilantism on the West Bank, Hindu cow vigilantism against Muslims in India. We have attacks on migrants and minorities in Russia, anti-immigration militias and vigilant groups in Germany, in Italy. We have this kind of militia vigilantism in Slovakia and the Czech Republic. Border patrols and performability along the US-Mexican borders. Vigilant groups against migrants in Bulgaria. I see we'll have a presentation on that in the next session. I look forward to that. And further on, Golden Dawn in Greece, fascist vigilantism in Italy and in France. We have and in Britain, and we have several case studies covering the most transnational phenomena we've seen, the soldiers of Odin in Finland, Norway, Canada, and Sweden. In our study, we identified 4 main types of contemporary vigilante activities. These were vigilante lynching, pogroms and terrorism, paramilitary militia movements, border patrols, and street patrols. And I will say a few words about each of these. Vigilante terrorism, pogroms, and lynchings is, in a way, the classical case of this is the Ku Klux Klan lynchings of blacks and other minorities, usually accused of having committed crimes or breaking the moral order or of white supremacy. That this sort of horrible image is from a lynching in Minnesota in 2020, and it's actually from a postcard. Some of these lynchings, this was not by Ku Klux Klan, but some of these lynchings ended up in postcards that people sent around to their friends. That's quite says something about the mood and view on lynchings in those times. Similar processes took place in Russia with murderous campaigns against migrants and homosexuals. And during the time period 2006 to 10, vigilante terrorism and violence could continue for several years in Russia, mainly because the police looked the other way. Another extreme case we had in a series of murders of Roma people in Hungary in 2008 and 9, where a killer commando of 4 perpetrators killed 10 people, including a child, and wounded 6 more when they attacked Roma villages with guns. They justified their actions by claiming that they intended to take revenge for so-called gypsy crimes and provoke violent reactions from Roma to trigger an ethnic civil war. In reality, the victims were selected randomly and had no particular relation to gypsy crime. The second type is what we call the paramilitary or militia movements. What distinguish this is the Hungarian Guard in Hungary, marching through a Roma village to scare people there, and they usually they are modeled on a military style and form of organization, and they usually wear military-like uniforms, performing parades and marches, and have a structured chain of command and train military skills, sometimes also with firearms. In Central Eastern Europe, there are long traditions of paramilitary militias, often affiliated with parties on the extreme right. And in recent years, the most significant initiative was this establishment of the Hungarian Guard in 2007 as the militia wing of the right-wing extremist Jobbik party. The Hungarian Guard was tasked to protect Hungarian citizens against the so-called gypsy crime, sometimes marching through Roma villages and neighborhoods to intimidate the inhabitants. They were banned after a while, but they inspired other groups in neighboring countries like in Slovakia and the Czech Republic, also targeting gypsies and migrants. A third type is what we call vigilante border patrols, which also take different shapes. And during a time period where there have been a heavy influx of refugees and undocumented migrants crossing national borders, and this issue has been high on the political and media agenda, there has frequently been vigilante responses to this, claiming that the government border agencies are unable to fulfill their task of controlling the borders. Some activists have volunteered to so-called help the protected borders. We see on the left the ship by the identitarian movement patrolling the Mediterranean Sea. We had the Minutemen patrolling the US-Mexican border down on the left, and the so-called Migrant Hunters in Bulgaria on the right, just the three examples. And these are private groups of migrant hunters that claim that they have to take over the task that the government is not fulfilling. And we have several cases of that, case studies of that in our study. The fourth group is what we call vigilante street patrols, and it's perhaps the most common type of vigilante activities against migrants and minorities, where organized groups walk together in the streets or near particular places where the stated goal is to provide protection against people who might constitute a risk of crime. They claim that their presence will deter criminals and provide a sense of safety to the good and vulnerable citizens, and to women in particular. These pictures are from the group I studied in Norway, the Soldiers of Odin, and I was out with them this evening when the pictures were taken. Yeah, and some of these street patrols are organized by far-right parties, typically neo-fascist parties. In Nordic countries, we had the Nordic Resistance Movement, which is a neo-Nazi movement, and they use it clearly to advertise their organization. Others are private initiatives. What is striking is that these patrols rarely commit acts of violence, but they display a violent capacity. So this is quite typical of these groups. Then we can ask, why do they do this? Why do they spend their time and efforts on such vigilant activities? And the first reason is what we call the external justifications, the official mission of the group as presented to the public, to the media and authorities. That is to protect the community against certain crime threats that the police and other authorities allegedly do not have the capacity or the will to handle alone. And these justifications are typically very altruistic, that they are tailored to resonate with widely held concerns in society, for example, on migration, crime, terrorism, or sexual abuse, and issues high on the media agenda. We see here some examples of this kind of public panic, moral panics. This is from a Polish magazine front page, where you see the European flag and dark hands raping a white woman. Yeah. And this is part of their typical propaganda, these groups. The other justification is what we call group strategies, that they are the internal reasoning for why leaders believe it will serve the interest of the group to engage in vigilant activities. These reasons are not meant for public consumption. This dimension is particularly relevant when the far-right political parties or other organizations organize vigilant activities such as street patrols in order to attract media attention and public support, and to promote the organization and its relevance, and to mobilize new members. These organizations' parties all used vigilant activities strategically to promote their organizations, to get publicity and new members. but they always justify publicly their efforts by pointing to their official higher mission, which was to stop crime, rapes, and illegal migrants. However, none of these official goals were ever met. Their vigilant activities were not really instrumental in stopping any specific crimes, and that was probably not the real goal either. The third motivation has to do with the individual drivers behind why individuals participate in vigilant activities groups. Some participants may be driven by motives that are congruent with the official mission of the group, but many of the individual members are clearly motivated by quite different reasons than the official ones. One example is the individual motivations at odds with the official justification group are the soldiers of Odin in Norway that I studied. Their official justification was for the street patrols was to help to make the streets safe. You see here the picture from that is actually the first patrol, and this is how they really wanted to be seen, helping vulnerable, somewhat drunk girls safely home from parties in the city. That is what they wanted to portray, but they wanted to organize their so-called walks in parts of town where violence, rape, and drugs dealing was likely to take place, and drive away unwanted persons. They should observe, document, and report to police, and only intervene if lives were in danger or serious harms could be prevented. However, it was a striking paradox that the large majority probably of the active members and many of the local leaders had themselves considerable criminal records, typically including violence, public order disturbances, sexual offenses, illegal weapons, and drugs. Most of them were young men in their 20s and 30s, probably at the end of a youth criminal career. And to many of this was a case, for example, with the guy on the left who was one of the actual national leader. He had a long criminal record. And to many of these, the soldiers of Odin offered an opportunity to make up for the criminal past and be seen as doing something good for society, thereby improving their tarnished reputation in the community. And such motivations may have to do with the desire to improve one's personal identity and status, in particular by individuals who were known as troublemakers and criminals. However, the police were not overly enthusiastic about receiving help to maintain public order from these people. So when we ask why do these groups emerge and decline, under what circumstances do the activities emerge and flourish and fail, and what are the circumstances and responses that prevent these movements from getting a foothold, so that they decline or disappear, as for example happened with the soldiers of Odin in many countries. The Norwegian branch lasted for less than a year, for example. The first factor is a widespread perception of crisis and threats to our lifestyle and society. Real or imagined, that's one of the first factors for why they emerge. This causes fear among sections of the population, often magnified by extensive media coverage and rhetoric by far-right political groups that capitalize on the fear. And they perceive the perceived threat of sexual assaults against so-called our women seems to strike a particular raw nerve among some groups of men. A second factor is that the threat of crime is identified with specific groups that become objects of hatred and fear. In many European countries, the marginalized Roma population have for a long time been strongly identified with criminal behavior and targeted by vigilant activities. And more recently, and particularly during and after the large influx of refugees and other migrants in 2015 and 16 into Europe and also into the United States, migrants have become perceived as a major crime threat. Adding to this wave was a wave of severe terrorist attacks committed by Islamist militants in Europe during the same period. Muslim migrants became perceived as the main group from which threats of crime and violence emerged, and to some extent replacing the Roma people in that role. A third factor is specific shocking events causing moral panic, and this may trigger vigilant activities. One such turning point in Europe were the events on New Year Eve 2015-16 in Cologne, Germany, where large numbers of local women were sexually harassed and abused by men of mainly North African and Middle Eastern origin. And this event triggered vigilante responses in many countries and boosted street patrols groups like the Soldiers of Odin and others. The Soldiers of Odin clearly emerged as a result of the events in Cologne and the moral panic. At least it spread. It was established in Finland a couple of months earlier, but the international spread came as a direct response of that event. And during the first month of 2015, Soldiers of Odin and similar vigilante groups popped up all over Europe and even in Australia and North America. And there was a perception that the police and other authorities were either unable or unwilling to protect the citizens from threats to their safety. And that is obviously a major factor to facilitate for the emergence of such vigilantism. The police in Cologne were heavily criticized in the aftermath of the New Year events for failing to intervene properly against the mass sexual assaults and a reluctance to provide truthful information about the perpetrator's ethnicity out of a sense of political correctness and fear of causing xenophobia and Islamophobia. And the opposite actually happened. The slogan turned from refugees welcome to refugees not welcome, just overnight, literally, after that event. The call for vigilantism is closely associated with a lack of trust in governmental institutions in general and the police in particular. We can see how there are more vigilantism in countries where the general trust in authorities and police is lower than in countries where it's higher. That is something we can see, for example, from the Eurobarometer. Also, countries with permissive legislation for armed self-defense or civil patrols provide opportunities for vigilantism. I mean, the liberal gun laws in the United States on gun ownership and the right to use armed force for self-defense and protecting your property goes very far in legalizing vigilantism, for example. And in most European countries, application for gun permits would not be turned down flatly if the reason was given was self-protection. So clearly, the differences, national differences here. And this brings us to traditions of vigilantism and militia. Again, the United States is a special case with its Wild West history of frontier justice and lynchings, and a popular culture and film industry where vigilantism, street justice, and revenge are main themes. Clearly in the United States, this historical cultural dimension facilitate a widespread mindset where vigilantism become a natural response to perceived threats. In Central and Eastern Europe, there are also historical traditions of fascist militia, for example, especially during the interwar period. And this has served as a model and inspiration to modern day extreme right parties and movements to establish similar paramilitary groups. And we find this in countries like Italy, Germany, Hungary, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, for example. Vigilantism also thrives in societies where there is a base of support for vigilant activities and vigilantism among the public and among political parties. Most vigilante groups described in our case studies put a lot of effort into gaining support from the public and recognition from the police and the government, but with limited or no success in most countries. When the police and other authorities turn a blind eye to vigilant activities or even tacitly accept or actively support this kind of violence, vigilantism in its most violent forms is likely to be rampant. The Ku Klux Klan lynchings and the murderous attacks on migrants and homosexuals in Russia are examples of how such violent campaigns could continue unhindered for a long time. So what makes vigilantism decline and fail? And this brings us to the other side of the coin. Why do vigilante movements fall apart and end their activities? Obviously, the absence, reductions, or reversal of the facilitating conditions mentioned before may also serve as impeding factors. But there are also some additional conditions that may play a role. For example, when the perceived threat is reduced or appears less acute, the appeal of vigilante responses became less persuasive. For example, when a decline in the number of migrants crossing borders into Europe after 2016 decline, this also had an impact in terms of reduction in vigilantism. So some of these perceived threats are media bubbles, and when the news media turn their attention to other issues, the moral panic among part of the population will also decline. Also, when the police and other authorities are able to demonstrate that they are in control of the situation, the appeal of vigilante activism will also be limited. And there is a directly related to the level of trust in the police and other authorities. In countries and cities where the police is generally respected and trusted by most of the population, initiatives to establish vigilante patrols to provide safety in the street will usually fall flat. And that also means that there will be a lack of support for vigilant groups and activities from the public, politicians, and news media. And this is also a major factor when attempts to establish vigilant patrols and militias fail. This was very evident in Norway, where the soldiers of Odin did not get support from any political party, not even from the right-wing populist party, nor from any significant part of the public. And the police was very explicit when they said that they did not want any assistance from the public, from the soldiers of Odin to maintain public order. And also, when the police and other authorities strike down hard on vigilant violence and hate crimes, such activities usually come to an end. And this was the case with the Ku Klux Klan. They continued with the lynchings and vigilante terrorism without much interference or even with protection from law enforcement until the 1960s. But from the 1970s onwards, there was a marked change, where more legal prosecutions of Klan terrorists, increased FBI surveillance and infiltrations of the organization, also bankrupting of the Klan organization through civil lawsuits on behalf of victims. And similar things happened in Russia, bringing an end to this terrorist campaign against migrants by vigilante groups. Restrictive legislation on vigilantism and police enforcement of such laws does also reduce the leeway of vigilante activities and may even put an end to it. We saw, for example, in Hungary that the government and the court declared that activities of the Hungarian Guard were against the human and minority rights guaranteed by the constitution, that the Guard had to be disbanded, and that happened also to a large extent. There were attempts to revive it, but they also amended the criminal code to make sure that such activities in the future would not be possible. There was a law called prohibited policing activity, for example. Other circumstances that weakens vigilante groups and activities is the inherent tendency in extreme right movements towards internal conflicts and splits. They tend to fight over ideology and strategy and methods, and often destroy themselves. And that happened also with the Norwegian version of the Soldiers of Odin. So I think that brings my presentation to an end. I can end with a commercial. Well, it's not really a commercial because this book is for free. It's an open access book. You can go to the Routledge homepage and download it for free there. And as I said, it's a lot of interesting stuff for reading, for people, both for anthropologists and people interested in vigilantism more generally. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bjørgo. This was like a illustrating speech, I would say, because it drew on all these kind of different experiences first, and then the photos were extremely interesting because I didn't personally know myself the experience in Norway. I was aware of some other experiences, but this was quite illustrating and I think thought-provoking. I have some questions myself, but I want to first give up the space if people have questions.